In the summer of 1857, a single spark of anger ignited one of the most powerful uprisings in the history of British rule in India. Soldiers turned against officers. Cities rose in rebellion. An empire built on control and confidence was suddenly shaken. What began as a military revolt soon became a nationwide challenge to British authority. This is the story of the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for being here and for choosing to explore history together. Today's story takes us to a turning point in the history of the British Empire in India. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was not just a mutiny or a protest. It was a complex uprising shaped by fear, resentment, belief, and the deep wounds of colonial rule. Understanding this rebellion helps explain why British rule changed forever after it ended. Before we begin, consider this question. Was the rebellion of 1857 a sudden military mutiny, or the first major war of resistance against British rule? Share your thoughts, and let us begin. By the middle of the 19th century, India had been transformed in ways few could have imagined a century earlier. What began as a trading venture had become a system of control stretching across most of the subcontinent. It ruled, commanded, taxed, and judged, shaping the lives of millions through power exercised in distant offices and guarded by armed force. Company rule expanded gradually, often through treaties, alliances, and calculated interventions. When resistance appeared, it was met with military strength. Indian kingdoms that once governed their own affairs were defeated, absorbed, or reduced to dependency. Some rulers were removed entirely. Others remained on their thrones but ruled only in name, their authority limited by company oversight and obligation. The company maintained control through its armies. Indian soldiers formed the majority of these forces, trained and organized under British command. Administration followed conquest. Territories were divided into districts and provinces. British officials oversaw courts, revenue offices, and police systems. Decisions once shaped by local custom were now guided by regulations written in unfamiliar language. Authority became centralized, structured, and distant. Taxation was one of the most powerful instruments of company rule. Land revenue provided the foundation of government income. Assessments were fixed and demanded regular payment, often in cash. For farmers, this created relentless pressure. Failure to meet demands led to debt, confiscation, or legal action. These policies altered rural life profoundly. Agriculture shifted from subsistence toward market dependence. Farmers grew crops not only to eat, but to sell, in order to pay taxes. This change increased vulnerability to price fluctuations and poor harvests. A single bad season could push families into lasting hardship. Economic pressure extended beyond the countryside. Traditional industries that had flourished for generations began to decline. Indian textiles, metalwork, and handicrafts struggled to compete with cheaper British manufactured goods. Markets filled with imports, while local workshops closed. Artisans who once relied on steady demand lost their livelihoods. Skills passed down through families became less valuable. In an economy shaped by foreign production, towns known for craft and trade fell into stagnation, their prosperity drained away. Trade policies favored British interests. India supplied raw materials and consumed finished goods. Profits flowed outward, enriching company shareholders and the British economy. Within India, wealth became unevenly distributed, concentrated among merchants and intermediaries connected to company systems. Infrastructure expanded during this period, but its purpose was specific. Roads, canals, and later railways supported revenue collection and military movement. Grain and goods could be transported quickly, often toward ports rather than local markets. These networks strengthened control rather than local resilience. Social change added to growing unease. Legal reforms replaced long-standing customs with standardized codes. Courts judged disputes according to unfamiliar principles. Missionary activity and educational changes introduced new ideas that unsettled established beliefs. While some welcomed reform, others saw it as intrusion. Indian rulers who remained faced strict supervision. Their armies were limited, their finances monitored, and their policies influenced by company officials. Ceremonial respect masked the reality of dependence. Authority had shifted decisively. Discontent did not erupt immediately. It spread quietly, carried in conversations, letters, and shared experience. Farmers felt pressure in their fields. Artisans felt it in empty workshops. Soldiers felt it in unequal treatment and restricted advancement. Rulers felt it in lost power. For many, the company appeared distant and unaccountable. Decisions affecting daily life were made far away by officials who did not share language, culture, or faith. Complaints had little effect. Justice seemed uneven, shaped by priorities that favored stability and revenue over fairness. Economic hardship met political frustration. Cultural anxiety met military dissatisfaction. Its administrators trusted systems, reports, and discipline. India under company rule before 1857 was a land governed by structure but unsettled in spirit. Power appeared firm, yet loyalty was conditional. The East India Company had achieved dominance, but not harmony. Its rule rested on efficiency and coercion rather than trust. The silence that spread across society was not acceptance, but restraint. Authority expanded, but understanding did not. Pressure mounted, but release had not yet come. Beneath the routines of administration and trade, a profound reckoning was approaching. Before 1857, company rule shaped India through armies, taxes, and administration. It reordered economies, displaced rulers, and altered daily life. It created a system that looked stable from above, yet was increasingly unstable from within. When it broke, it would reveal the limits of power built without consent, and mark the end of company rule forever. By the middle of the 19th century, the Indian subcontinent had undergone a profound transformation. What once consisted of many kingdoms, courts, and regional powers was now largely controlled by a single foreign authority. The British East India Company, which had arrived centuries earlier as a trading enterprise, stood at the center of political power across vast territories. Company rule did not emerge overnight. It grew through treaties, wars, and calculated expansion. Military victories allowed the company to defeat rivals and suppress resistance. Where armies advanced, administration followed. Forts became headquarters. Trading posts became centers of governance. Authority was enforced through a combination of armed strength and legal control. The company governed through its armies first and foremost. Indian soldiers formed the backbone of these forces. Trained to fight in European-style formations and deployed across the subcontinent. British officers commanded them. Planned campaigns. And enforced discipline. Garrisons dotted the landscape. Reminding towns and villages of the power that stood behind company orders. Alongside military force came taxation. Revenue collection became the foundation of company rule. Land was surveyed, assessed, and taxed according to new systems designed to maximize income. Farmers were required to meet fixed demands, regardless of harvest conditions. Failure to pay brought penalties, loss of land, or debt. Administration expanded rapidly. Courts were reorganized. Bureaucracy reached into everyday life, recording property, classifying people, and regulating behavior. Decisions that once rested with local rulers or councils were now made by distant administrators. Indian rulers faced removal or reduction. Some were defeated outright and their territories annexed. Others were allowed to remain, but only as symbolic figures. Their authority was limited. Their finances were controlled. Their rule was no longer independent but dependent. Traditional industries that had flourished for generations began to decline. Artisans struggled as local markets weakened and imported goods increased. Handcrafted textiles, once prized across regions, faced competition that disrupted livelihoods. Workshops closed. Skills passed down through families lost their value. Trade routes shifted to serve company interests. Raw materials flowed outward. Finished goods flowed inward. Wealth moved away from local economies toward company centers and overseas destinations. For many communities, prosperity became harder to sustain. Land policies intensified pressure. Revenue demands remained high even during hardship. Peasants sold land to meet obligations. Moneylenders gained influence. Rural society changed as ownership shifted and insecurity grew. The land, once a source of stability, became a source of anxiety. Urban centers reflected similar strain. Clerks, laborers, and traders found employment within company systems. But competition was fierce and advancement limited. Opportunities favored those who served administration directly. Others faced rising costs and uncertain prospects. Despite these changes, resistance was not always visible. Discontent spread quietly. Discontent spread quietly. It appeared in conversations, in complaints. In complaints, in small acts of defiance. People adapted where they could, endured where they must. And remembered older ways of life that now seemed distant. Religious and social institutions were affected as well. The company often claimed neutrality, yet its policies altered long-standing arrangements. Patronage declined. Customs were regulated. Communities felt their traditions increasingly constrained by unfamiliar rules. Education introduced new ideas, but also new divisions. Schools trained clerks and assistants for company service. Knowledge became a path to limited opportunity, but also a reminder of exclusion. Many learned the language of governance without gaining real influence. The company viewed its rule as rational and efficient. Officials spoke of order, improvement, and progress. They believed administration would bring stability to a complex land. From their perspective, control was necessary to manage diversity. They believed administration would bring stability to a complex land. From their perspective, control was necessary to manage diversity. From their perspective, control was necessary to manage diversity. Indian soldiers served the system that governed their families and villages. They enforced laws that shaped their own society. Loyalty was demanded and often given, but questions lingered beneath the surface. By the 1840s and 1850s, company rule appeared firm. Armies were strong. Revenue flowed. Administration functioned. On the surface, the system seemed secure. Yet beneath this appearance lay accumulated strain. Economic pressure touched nearly every class. Traditional elites lost power. Farmers faced uncertainty. Artisans struggled to survive. Soldiers served faithfully but observed inequality. The company ruled through control rather than consent. It managed territory effectively, but it did not build shared ownership of governance. Participation was limited. Authority was concentrated. Discontent did not always take the form of open protest. It spread quietly, patiently, across society. It settled into memory and experience. People compared past and present, weighing loss against stability. India under company rule before 1857 was a land reshaped by foreign governance. Armies enforced order. Taxes funded expansion. Administration replaced tradition. Rulers were displaced or diminished. The system achieved dominance, but at a cost. Economic hardship grew. Social structures shifted. Trust weakened. The company governed vast lands, yet it ruled a society increasingly aware of what it had lost and what it had not gained. This quiet discontent did not announce itself loudly. It waited. It gathered strength in daily life. And in shared experience. And in unspoken expectation. By the mid-19th century, the surface of company rule appeared solid. But beneath it, the ground was slowly changing. In the opening months of 1857, life inside the military cantonments of northern India followed familiar routines. Drills were conducted at dawn. Orders were issued with precision. On the surface, discipline appeared intact. Yet beneath this order, tension had been quietly building for years. Unequal treatment, cultural distance, and growing mistrust had already weakened the bond between Indian soldiers and their British officers. Into this fragile atmosphere came a change that seemed minor, even technical. New rifle cartridges were introduced for use with the latest weapons. For British officers, this was a matter of modernization and efficiency. For the soldiers expected to use them, it was something far more personal. Almost immediately, rumors began to circulate. The cartridges, it was said, were greased with animal fat. To load the rifle, soldiers had to bite the cartridge open with their teeth. Word spread that the grease came from cows and pigs. Whether true or not, the belief took hold quickly and firmly. For Hindu soldiers, the cow held sacred meaning. For Muslim soldiers, the pig was forbidden. The idea that both groups were being forced to violate deeply held religious principles struck at the core of identity and belief. This was not a simple matter of equipment. It was perceived as an assault on faith. Attempts by British officers to dismiss or deny the rumors came too late and carried little weight. Years of cultural misunderstanding had eroded confidence in official explanations. Even assurances that alternative grease could be used failed to calm fears. Once suspicion had taken root, it proved difficult to remove. The cartridge controversy became a symbol. It represented more than grease or rifles. It came to embody the wider sense that British authorities neither understood nor respected Indian customs. What soldiers heard in the rumors aligned with what many already felt, that their beliefs were ignored and their voices unheard. Fear spread quietly through the ranks. Conversations in barracks grew tense. Some refused to handle the cartridges. Others hesitated, unsure of the consequences of obedience or resistance. The atmosphere thickened with uncertainty. British command responded with discipline. Refusal to use the cartridges was treated as insubordination. Punishments followed, including public humiliation and harsh sentences. These actions, meant to restore order, instead deepened resentment. Trust collapsed rapidly. Soldiers no longer saw their officers as protectors or leaders, but as enforcers of a system that threatened their identity. Fear turned into anger, and anger into resolve. What had begun as rumor now became conviction. The cartridge became a shared grievance, uniting soldiers of different backgrounds under a common sense of betrayal. What made the situation especially dangerous was its timing. Economic pressures, social tensions, and political dissatisfaction already weighed heavily on Indian society. The army, drawn from that society, reflected these strains. The cartridge issue did not create discontent. It focused it. For British authorities, the reaction seemed disproportionate. From their perspective, the issue could be resolved through clarification and discipline. They underestimated how deeply the matter resonated. They also failed to grasp how symbolic gestures could outweigh practical explanations. In early 1857, isolated incidents of defiance began to appear. Soldiers refused orders. Punishments escalated. Each confrontation hardened positions on both sides. Dialogue gave way to suspicion, and suspicion to confrontation. The cartridge controversy became the final spark. It did not stand alone, but it ignited what had been carefully prepared by years of tension. Once resistance began, it spread rapidly, moving beyond the original issue into open rebellion. When violence erupted, British officials were shocked by its scale and intensity. They searched for explanations, often pointing back to the cartridges as the cause. Yet the deeper truth was more complex. The cartridges were the trigger, not the foundation. For Indian soldiers, the controversy confirmed their worst fears. In such a climate, obedience lost its moral anchor. Resistance, once unthinkable, became justified in their minds. The events that followed reshaped history. The Uprising of 1857 would challenge British rule across northern India and leave lasting scars. The cartridge controversy stands as a reminder of how small decisions can carry immense weight. A technical change, poorly communicated and rigidly enforced, became a symbol of disrespect. In a system already strained, it tipped the balance. What seemed like a minor issue of military supply revealed the fragile foundations of empire. Authority depended not only on power, but on understanding. When understanding vanished, power alone could not hold loyalty. In 1857, a piece of paper wrapped in grease exposed the distance between rulers and soldiers. Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into action. And a controversy over cartridges became the spark that set a subcontinent ablaze. The lesson of that moment endures. Empires are not undone only by great battles or grand ideas. Sometimes, they unravel through silence, rumor, and the failure to listen. May 10, 1857 began like any other day in the cantonment town of Meerut. The parade grounds were quiet, and routine seemed intact. Yet beneath the surface, tension had been building for months. Resentment, fear, and mistrust had settled into the ranks of the Indian soldiers. Meerut was one of the largest military centers in northern India. Thousands of Indian troops lived and trained there alongside British officers. Discipline was strict, and obedience was expected without question. But recent events had shaken that discipline to its core. Discontent had grown steadily. Changes in military practice caused anxiety among the soldiers. Rumors spread quickly through barracks and villages. Many believed their traditions, beliefs, and honor were under threat. Confidence in British authority was weakening. On the evening of May 10, the tension finally broke. Indian soldiers turned against their officers. The rebellion began suddenly, but it was not spontaneous. It was the release of long-held anger. British officers were attacked in their quarters. Control of the barracks slipped away within hours. Arms were seized, buildings overtaken, and discipline collapsed. The structure that had enforced obedience now lay fractured. Fires appeared across the cantonment. The sound of alarm bells mixed with shouting and confusion. What had been a military station became a place of chaos and decision. There was no turning back. The rebels understood that remaining in Meerut would invite swift punishment. They needed a symbol, a center, and legitimacy. Their destination was clear. They would march to Delhi. Through the night, columns of soldiers moved out of Meerut. They carried weapons, supplies, and determination. The road to Delhi stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty and purpose. Villagers watched as the force passed, unsure of what the movement meant. Delhi was more than a city. It was the former heart of imperial India. Though British power ruled in practice, the Mughal emperor still lived there. His authority was symbolic, but symbols mattered deeply. When the rebels reached Delhi, the city was unprepared. British defenses were limited, and confusion spread quickly. The soldiers entered the city with urgency and resolve. Authority changed hands in a matter of hours. The Mughal emperor was declared the symbolic leader of the uprising. This act transformed a military mutiny into something larger. It linked the rebellion to a vision of restored sovereignty. Delhi became the center of resistance. News traveled fast. Messages moved along roads, rivers, and rumor. Across northern India, soldiers and civilians heard what had happened at Meerut and Delhi. The rebellion was no longer local. It was spreading. For British authorities, the shock was immense. Meerut had been considered secure. The loyalty of the army had been taken for granted. Now the foundation of control was under threat. The revolt revealed deep fractures in colonial rule. The army, once the pillar of British power, had turned inward. Confidence in command collapsed. Urgent decisions were required, but clarity was scarce. In Delhi, the rebels attempted to organize. Different groups arrived with different aims. Some sought restoration of old authority. Others demanded justice or revenge. Unity was fragile, but momentum was strong. The Mughal court, long reduced to ceremony, was thrust into crisis. The emperor became a symbol of resistance rather than a ruler with real power. Yet for the rebels, his presence gave meaning to their cause. It connected the uprising to history. As days passed, the rebellion expanded outward from Delhi. Garrisons across the region faced unrest. British responses began to form. The empire was slow to react, but it would respond with determination. What began on May 10 was more than an outbreak of violence. It was the moment when accumulated grievances turned into open defiance. Meerut became the spark that ignited a wider rebellion. Delhi became its heart. The revolt challenged the idea that British rule was unshakable. It exposed how thin control could be when trust disappeared. Authority based on discipline alone proved vulnerable. For the Indian soldiers, the decision to rebel carried immense risk. They faced overwhelming power if defeated. Yet they chose action over submission. Their march from Meerut to Delhi reshaped history. The events of that day echoed far beyond the cantonment. They marked the beginning of a conflict that would engulf much of northern India. The rebellion had begun, and nothing would remain the same again. The uprising did not remain confined to a single spark. Once ignited, it moved swiftly across northern India, carried by rumor, fear, hope, and long-held grievance. What began as isolated resistance soon became a chain reaction, linking cities, towns, and countryside into a shared moment of upheaval. News traveled fast, even without formal networks. Messengers moved along roads. Travelers carried stories from market to market. Soldiers spoke in barracks. The uprising did not remain confined to a single spark. Delhi emerged early as a powerful symbol. The city carried deep historical meaning, associated with past empires and lost sovereignty. When resistance reached its streets, it drew attention far beyond its walls. Kanpur soon followed as another center of unrest. Its location and military importance made it a focal point. Local forces joined the uprising, and civilians were drawn into the turmoil. The city became a place where grievances converged, shaped by anger at company rule and uncertainty about the future. Lucknow, long a center of culture and administration, was pulled into the conflict as well. Its palaces and neighborhoods became scenes of resistance. The uprising here reflected deep frustration with annexation and the loss of traditional power. The city stood as an example of how political decisions made years earlier now returned with force. Jhansi added another dimension to the revolt. Local leadership played a significant role, blending organized resistance with popular support. The region became known for determined opposition, drawing fighters motivated by loyalty, honor, and the desire to defend autonomy. Civilians supported resistance in varied ways, from direct involvement to providing shelter and supplies. Local rulers assessed their position, some seeing opportunity to reclaim authority lost under company expansion. Motivations were not uniform. Some participants fought to restore old kingdoms and dynasties that had been displaced. They viewed the uprising as a chance to reverse annexation and reclaim status. Others were driven by broader resentment toward foreign control, seeking an end to company dominance rather than a return to the past. Others were driven by broader resentment toward foreign control, seeking an end to company dominance rather than a return to the past. This diversity shaped the character of the revolt. In some places, resistance followed organized command structures, resembling formal warfare. In some places, resistance followed organized command structures, resembling formal warfare. In others, it took the form of spontaneous popular uprisings, fueled by local anger and collective action. In others, it took the form of spontaneous popular uprisings, fueled by local anger and collective action. The rebellion adapted to each region it touched. The rebellion adapted to each region it touched. The countryside played a crucial role. Villages became centers of support and resistance. Local networks provided intelligence and movement. Reports arrived late or incomplete. Decisions were made without clear information. This uncertainty allowed the rebellion to gain ground before coordinated responses could be organized. Fear and hope moved together. For some, the revolt represented liberation. For some, the revolt represented liberation. For others, it brought anxiety and disruption. For others, it brought anxiety and disruption. Communities faced difficult choices, balancing survival with belief. Communities faced difficult choices, balancing survival with belief. Neutrality was often impossible, as pressure came from both sides. Neutrality was often impossible, as pressure came from both sides. The presence of the company, once assumed permanent, suddenly appeared fragile. The presence of the company, once assumed permanent, suddenly appeared fragile. As resistance spread, the nature of authority changed. As resistance spread, the nature of authority changed. Local leaders stepped forward where company control weakened. Local leaders stepped forward where company control weakened. Temporary administrations formed. Temporary administrations formed. Symbols of imperial power were challenged or removed. Symbols of imperial power were challenged or removed. The presence of the company, once assumed permanent, suddenly appeared fragile. The uprising did not follow a single strategy. It shifted constantly, shaped by geography, leadership, and circumstance. Organized battles took place alongside smaller acts of defiance. The absence of unified command made the movement unpredictable, but also difficult to suppress quickly. Reinforcements became necessary, and responses grew more forceful. The realization that multiple regions were involved at once altered perception. What had been seen as manageable unrest now appeared as a widespread challenge to rule itself. Despite shared opposition, coordination among rebel centers remained limited. Distance, communication barriers, and differing goals prevented full unity. Each region fought its own struggle, connected by purpose but divided by circumstance. This fragmentation would later shape the outcome. Still, the rapid spread itself marked a turning point. It revealed the depth of discontent and the speed with which authority could unravel. The company had relied on control through discipline and administration. The uprising showed how quickly that control could be contested. Cities like Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, and Jhansi became enduring symbols of resistance. Their experiences entered memory as examples of courage, loss, and defiance. They represented the varied faces of the revolt, from royal ambition to popular anger. It challenged assumptions about stability and obedience. It demonstrated that resistance could move faster than authority, carried by people rather than orders. By the time control was reasserted, the landscape had changed. Trust was broken. Certainty was gone. The revolt had taken many forms, and in doing so, it exposed the complexity of rule and resistance alike. Together, they formed a moment when the established order was tested across an entire region. The spread itself became the message. Control was no longer unquestioned. And the future of governance would never be the same. When rebellion spread across northern India in 1857, Britain responded with force and urgency. Orders were sent, ships prepared, and a vast mobilization began across continents. Reinforcements arrived from Britain and from other parts of the empire. Troops landed at ports and moved inland along rivers and roads. Loyal units were reorganized, supplies gathered, and command structures tightened. The response was not improvised for long. It became systematic, driven by the determination to retake territory and reassert authority. By late 1857, British forces began the slow process of recapturing cities. Each advance carried risk. Roads were uncertain, communication fragile, and resistance unpredictable. Columns moved cautiously, securing positions step by step. The landscape itself seemed tense, marked by abandoned camps, damaged towns, and the traces of recent conflict. Urban centers became focal points of the campaign. Cities that had fallen to rebel control were surrounded and approached with care. Artillery was positioned, lines drawn, and negotiations attempted and abandoned. When assaults began, fighting was intense and destructive. Streets echoed with noise and confusion as control shifted block by block. Rural areas faced a different kind of warfare. Villages suspected of aiding resistance were searched, disarmed, and placed under surveillance. Movement was restricted. And authority asserted through patrols and checkpoints. The aim was not only to defeat armed opponents, but to break the networks that sustained rebellion. The campaign took a heavy toll on both sides. British soldiers endured long marches, disease, and exhaustion. For Indian fighters and civilians, losses were even greater. Lives were disrupted, families displaced, and livelihoods destroyed. Despite the violence, the fighting was not uniform. In some regions, resistance collapsed quickly. In others, it lingered, flaring unpredictably before fading. The lack of a single command among rebels made coordination difficult. While British forces increasingly benefited from centralized planning and reinforcements. As cities were retaken, symbols of company authority were restored. Flags were raised, offices reopened, and administrative routines resumed under military protection. The return of order was visible, but fragile. Every decision was shaped by the memory of rebellion and the fear of its return. British newspapers and officials framed the campaign as necessary and justified. The narrative emphasized restoration of peace and punishment of disorder. Yet even among British ranks, there was recognition of the scale of destruction. The conflict had revealed how deeply resentment had spread and how costly suppression could be. Early 1858, organized resistance had largely collapsed. Key leaders were captured or dispersed. Remaining pockets of opposition were isolated and neutralized. The empire had regained control, but the cost was undeniable. Entire regions bore scars that would last for generations. In the aftermath, the military presence remained heavy. Garrisons stayed in place, patrols continued, and surveillance intensified. The lesson drawn by British authorities was clear. Control had to be maintained through strength and vigilance. The idea of a lighter touch faded in the face of recent experience. Both sides suffered heavy losses, not only in numbers, but in trust. The relationship between rulers and ruled was permanently altered. Fear replaced any remaining illusion of partnership. The distance between authority and population widened. The response to the rebellion reshaped British thinking. Company rule was judged inadequate for such responsibility. The scale of the conflict convinced policymakers that a private corporation could not govern a vast and complex society through force alone. Structural change became inevitable. The brutality of the campaign left a lasting imprint on memory. Stories circulated quietly among survivors, shaping how events were understood and remembered. For British officials, the campaign became a warning. For Indians, it became a symbol of resistance met with overwhelming power. The end of fighting did not bring reconciliation. It brought control. Order was restored through dominance rather than consent. The machinery of rule resumed its work, now under closer supervision and tighter discipline. British response during the rebellion was decisive, relentless, and costly. Reinforcements, recaptured cities, and severe punishment achieved their immediate goal. Authority was reasserted. Yet the methods used revealed the limits of power based on fear. The warfare of 1857 and 1858 marked a turning point. It demonstrated how quickly control could be challenged and how brutally it could be restored. The empire survived, but it did so changed, hardened by conflict and aware that beneath the surface of order, resistance could rise again. In restoring rule, Britain secured territory but lost any remaining sense of trust. The campaign ended the rebellion. But it also ended an era. What followed would be more centralized, more cautious, and more distant. The memory of brutal warfare would shape imperial rule long after the last shots fell silent. By the opening months of 1858, the course of the Great Uprising had turned decisively. What had begun as a widespread and determined rebellion was now being forced back by relentless pressure. Across northern and central India, British forces advanced with renewed coordination, determined to retake the cities and forts that had become symbols of resistance. Delhi stood at the heart of this struggle. Once the seat of imperial memory and rebellion alike. The city had become a powerful symbol of defiance. Its recapture marked a turning point. British troops moved methodically through shattered streets and damaged gates. When Delhi finally fell, it was more than a military victory. It was a blow to the idea that the old order could be restored through revolt. The fall of Delhi sent shockwaves across the region. Rebel morale weakened, and the sense of unity that had briefly linked distant centers began to fracture. Without a symbolic capital, coordination became harder. Messages slowed. Trust between leaders faltered. The rebellion, once expansive, now fought on separate fronts. Lucknow was next. The city had endured long months of siege, resistance, and counterattack. Its streets had witnessed determination on both sides, and its defense had become legendary. When British forces finally secured Lucknow, it closed another chapter of resistance. Control over the city meant control over a critical administrative and strategic center. The capture of Lucknow carried a clear message. No stronghold, no matter how resolute, could remain beyond reach. Supplies dwindled. Safe havens disappeared. Rebel fighters were pushed into retreat, often melting back into the countryside. Further south, Jhansi became the focus of intense conflict. The town had emerged as a rallying point for resistance, its fortifications standing as a challenge to advancing forces. When Jiangxi was defeated, it marked the collapse of yet another major center. The fall was decisive. With it went the last hopes of holding territory against sustained military pressure. Across these regions, leaders met grim fates. Some were killed in battle. Others were captured after long pursuits. Many were exiled, removed from the lands where they had once commanded loyalty. Without leadership, resistance became fragmented and uncertain. By mid-1858, organized opposition had largely ended. Scattered fighting continued in pockets, but the unified movement was broken. British authority was reasserted through garrisons, patrols, and strict enforcement. Roads, cities, and communication lines were secured once more. Yet the end of fighting did not bring immediate calm. The landscape bore deep scars. Cities had suffered damage. Communities had been divided by loyalty and fear. The memory of violence lingered in everyday life, shaping how people viewed authority and one another. For British officials, the suppression of the rebellion brought relief and reflection. The uprising had revealed vulnerabilities within the existing system of rule. It had shown that loyalty could not be assumed, and that control through a commercial company had limits. Though order was restored, confidence had been shaken. For Indians, the consequences were complex. The rebellion had failed to achieve its immediate aims, but it had changed expectations forever. The fall of rebel centers did not erase the grievances that had fueled the uprising. Economic pressure, political exclusion, and cultural anxiety remained unresolved. The methods used to crush the rebellion also left a lasting impression. Authority now felt more direct and uncompromising. Surveillance increased. Military presence expanded. Policies hardened in the name of security. The relationship between ruler and ruled grew more distant, shaped by suspicion on both sides. At the same time, the rebellion created new memories of resistance. Stories of courage, loss, and defiance passed quietly through families and communities. Even in defeat, the uprising entered collective memory as a moment when authority had been challenged on a vast scale. The fall of Delhi, Lucknow, and Jiangxi marked the end of open rebellion, but not the end of change. In London, decisions were already being made that would transform how India was governed. The East India Company, blamed for misrule and failure, would soon lose its authority. Power would pass to the British Crown. This transition was shaped directly by the events of 1857 and 1858. The rebellion had forced a reckoning. Military victory restored control, but it also demanded reform. The empire could no longer rely on old assumptions. For those who lived through it, 1858 was a year of endings. The end of organized resistance. The end of company rule. The end of any illusion that India could be governed without consequence. The rebel centers had fallen, but the impact of the rebellion could not be undone. It had exposed fault lines within society and empire alike. It had demonstrated the depth of discontent and the power of shared grievance. The rebellion was crushed, yet it reshaped the future in ways that could not be reversed. The fall of rebel centers in 1858 closed one chapter of Indian history, but it opened another. From the ruins of resistance emerged a new phase of rule, one shaped by memory, fear, and change. The uprising had been defeated, but its echo would continue to influence the path ahead, long after the last stronghold had fallen. In the aftermath of the great upheaval of 1857, the foundations of British power in India stood exposed and shaken. What had begun as a military rebellion had revealed something far deeper. The system through which a private company ruled vast territories and millions of people had reached its limits. Confidence in company governance had collapsed, and the need for change could no longer be ignored. For nearly a century, the East India Company had transformed itself from a trading corporation into a ruling authority. It collected revenue, raised armies, and administered justice. Its officials governed in the name of commerce, yet exercised powers usually reserved for states. This unusual arrangement had long drawn criticism, but it survived as long as order seemed secure. The rebellion of 1857 shattered that sense of security. The violence and scale of the uprising shocked Britain. Questions echoed through Parliament and the press. Who was accountable when governance failed so dramatically? In 1858, the British government acted. The East India Company was formally dissolved. Its armies, territories, and administrative machinery were transferred to the British Crown. With a single decision, an era ended. Company rule, born of trade and sustained by revenue, was replaced by direct imperial authority. India now came under the rule of the Crown. Power no longer flowed through company directors and shareholders. This transition marked the beginning of what would become known as the British Raj. The Crown would govern not as a merchant, but as a sovereign. The language of governance shifted from commerce to empire. For many in Britain, the change promised greater responsibility and moral oversight. Direct rule was presented as more accountable, more humane, and more stable. In India, the transition felt more complex. Symbols changed, but authority remained foreign and distant. Symbols changed, but authority remained foreign and distant. Authority remained foreign and distant. Proclamations spoke of justice, tolerance, and protection of traditions. Proclamations spoke of justice, tolerance, and protection of traditions. The Crown pledged respect for local customs and religious practices. The Crown pledged respect for local customs and religious practices. These words were meant to restore trust after the trauma of rebellion. Administratively, the structure of governance was reorganized. A viceroy replaced the company governor-general, representing the Crown directly. A viceroy replaced the company governor-general, representing the Crown directly. Departments were streamlined, and lines of authority clarified. Departments were streamlined, and lines of authority clarified. The Indian civil service expanded its role, becoming the central instrument of rule. The Indian civil service expanded its role, becoming the central instrument of rule. The army was also reshaped. Lessons from the rebellion led to new recruitment policies and command structures. British control within the military was strengthened. Indian soldiers continued to form the majority of the ranks, but oversight tightened. Loyalty became the central concern. Despite these changes, imperial control remained firm. Decisions continued to be made by a small ruling elite. Representation for Indians was limited and carefully managed. Consultation existed, but power did not shift significantly. The Raj promised order and stability, but not self-rule. Economically, the foundations of governance remained tied to revenue. Land taxes, trade duties, and financial extraction continued to support administration and defense. While the Crown replaced the company, the economic logic of empire endured. India's resources still fueled imperial needs. For ordinary people, daily life did not change overnight. The promises of reform felt distant from the realities of village and city life. Yet the end of the East India Company carried symbolic weight. The rebellion had forced Britain to confront the consequences of governing without consent. The Crown now bore full responsibility for India, both in law and in history. The Raj was no longer an extension of trade. It was a political project, openly imperial and unapologetically authoritative. Britain ruled India directly, not through a company charter, but through the power of the state. For Indian elites and political thinkers, the change raised new questions. If governance was now a matter of the Crown, where did accountability lie? Could appeals be made to justice and rights within an imperial framework? These questions would grow louder in the decades to come. The end of company rule did not end resistance. Instead, it reshaped it. The focus of opposition shifted from corporate abuses to imperial authority itself. Nationalist ideas, still in early stages, found new targets and new language. The British Raj began with a promise of reform born from crisis. It sought to learn from the failures of the past while preserving control. This balance proved difficult to maintain. The Raj would endure for nearly 90 years, adapting and adjusting, but always shaped by its origins in the collapse of company rule. In 1858, the East India Company passed into history. Its legacy remained etched into institutions, laws, and landscapes. The British Crown inherited not only territories, but the consequences of decades of extraction and distance. The beginning of the Raj was not a clean break, but a transition layered with continuity and change. Governance evolved, symbols shifted, and authority was rebranded. Yet the fundamental reality endured. India was still ruled by an empire that was not its own. The end of the East India Company stands as a turning point. It closed one chapter of imperial history and opened another. Trade had become rule, and rule had become empire. The company vanished, but imperial control remained, setting the stage for the long struggle that would eventually define the final years of British rule in India. After the rebellion of 1857, British rule in India entered a new and uneasy phase. The uprising had shaken confidence in imperial authority and exposed the dangers of misunderstanding, arrogance, and haste. When control was restored, it was clear that governance could no longer continue as before. Every future decision would now be shaped by memory of revolt. The first change was in attitude. British officials became more cautious, more measured in their approach. The assumption of unquestioned loyalty had vanished. Rule would continue, but with greater awareness of its fragility. One of the most visible shifts concerned religion. Before the rebellion, reforms had often ignored or misunderstood religious sensitivities. After 1857, public respect for Indian religions became official policy. The British government declared that it would not interfere in matters of faith. Temples, mosques, and religious customs were to be left untouched. Missionary activity continued, but it was no longer openly supported by the state. Religion was recognized as a powerful force that could not be treated lightly. The army was another area of deep reform. The rebellion had revealed the danger of over-reliance on certain units and regions. Recruitment policies were revised to prevent unity that might lead to coordinated resistance. The composition of the army was deliberately reshaped. British planners focused on what they described as balance. Recruitment patterns shifted toward regions considered more reliable. Punjab, the northwest frontier, and hill areas became major sources of new soldiers. This approach was based on the belief that diversity within the ranks would prevent another unified uprising. Military discipline became even more rigid. Training emphasized obedience and separation from civilian influence. Soldiers were encouraged to see themselves as part of a professional force rather than a social group. The army remained loyal, but the trust between ruler and ruled was never fully restored. Administration also underwent gradual change. The East India Company was dissolved, and direct rule by the British Crown was established. This shift was meant to signal responsibility and stability. India was no longer governed by merchants, but by the imperial state. Indian participation in administration increased, but slowly. Educated Indians were appointed to lower and middle levels of government service. They worked as clerks, assistants, and advisors. However, real authority remained firmly in British hands. This limited inclusion served multiple purposes. It helped the administration function more efficiently. It also created a small class invested in the system. Yet progress was carefully controlled to avoid threatening British dominance. Legal and bureaucratic systems were expanded with caution. Law became a tool of order rather than experimentation. Policies were designed to avoid sudden change. Stability was prioritized above reform. Economic policy also reflected lessons from 1857. While revenue collection continued, officials were more alert to rural distress. Reports and surveys were used to monitor conditions. The goal was to prevent hardship from turning into unrest. Communication improved as well. Railways, telegraphs, and roads were expanded to allow faster response to trouble. The empire learned that delay could be dangerous. Speed and coordination became central to control. Despite these adjustments, fear lingered beneath the surface. Fear lingered beneath the surface. Public gatherings were closely watched. Political discussion was tolerated, but within limits. Caution defined governance. The state remained alert to signs of organized resistance. The memory of rebellion cast a long shadow. At the same time, the rebellion shaped Indian attitudes as well. Many Indians saw that the empire was not invincible. The uprising, though defeated, became a reference point for future generations. It showed that resistance was possible, even if costly. British policy aimed to prevent such unity from forming again. Divide and balance became guiding principles. Communities were categorized, monitored, and managed. Order was maintained, but trust was limited. By the late 19th century, the system appeared stable on the surface. The army was loyal, administration functioned, and revenue flowed. Yet this stability was built on caution rather than confidence. Indian participation continued to expand at a controlled pace. Educational opportunities increased, creating a growing professional class. These changes were intended to strengthen governance. Instead, they slowly produced new expectations. The policies introduced after 1857 delayed major upheaval, but they did not resolve underlying tensions. Respect for religion reduced immediate conflict. Military reform prevented large-scale mutiny. Administrative inclusion offered limited cooperation. But the memory of rebellion never faded. It shaped how Britain ruled and how India responded. Every reform carried restraint. Every act of authority carried fear of repetition. In the decades that followed, British India was governed by lessons learned in crisis. The empire survived, but it was permanently changed. Confidence gave way to caution. Innovation gave way to control. The rebellion of 1857 became a silent guide to policy. It influenced recruitment, religion, administration, and law. It stood as a reminder of the cost of misunderstanding and exclusion. British rule after 1857 was not softer, but it was more careful. Power was exercised with restraint, calculation, and memory. The empire moved forward, but always looking back. In this way, the rebellion shaped the future of British India. Not through victory, but through warning. Its shadow stretched across every decision, long after the fighting ended. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 did not achieve its immediate aim. British rule endured, stronger in structure and more cautious in approach. Yet to measure the rebellion only by its failure is to miss its deeper meaning. What unfolded that year reshaped power, memory, and resistance in ways that lasted far beyond the battlefield. In the aftermath, silence settled over regions that had once surged with urgency. Control was reasserted. Administration tightened. The symbols of authority returned to public spaces. On the surface, empire appeared restored. Beneath that surface, however, something fundamental had changed. The relationship between ruler and ruled was transformed. Before the rebellion, British authority had relied on a belief in stability and permanence. After 1857, that belief was gone. Rule continued, but with caution. Trust was replaced by surveillance. Confidence gave way to control. The rebellion had exposed how fragile domination could be. For the British, the uprising served as a warning. It revealed the danger of ignoring social custom, military morale, and local power. Governance became more centralized. Policies were adjusted to prevent unity among the ruled. The army was reorganized. Communication improved. The empire learned from shock, not from harmony. For Indians, the rebellion became something else entirely. It became a memory of defiance. Even in defeat, it showed that resistance was possible. The idea that foreign rule could be challenged entered public consciousness with new force. This idea could not be reversed. Stories of 1857 spread quietly over time. They lived in villages, families, and local traditions. Names of places and figures carried meaning. Songs, whispers, and retellings preserved moments of courage and loss. The rebellion became a symbol rather than an event. It represented the moment when obedience fractured and authority was questioned across a wide landscape. Its significance grew as later generations looked back, searching for origins of resistance and identity. Although the revolt lacked unity of leadership and purpose, its emotional impact was unified. It showed shared dissatisfaction across regions and communities. Soldiers, civilians, and local rulers had all taken part, each for their own reasons. Together, they revealed the breadth of opposition beneath imperial order. Later freedom movements drew inspiration from this legacy. Not always in strategy, but in spirit. The courage displayed in 1857 offered proof that sacrifice could shape history, even when outcomes were uncertain. The rebellion became a reference point, a reminder that change rarely begins with success. National thinkers and activists revisited 1857 with renewed interest. They debated its meaning, its failures, and its lessons. Some saw it as the first collective challenge to foreign rule. Others viewed it as a fragmented uprising shaped by circumstance. These debates kept the memory alive and relevant. The rebellion also shaped how empire viewed dissent. Resistance was no longer seen as isolated disturbance. It was recognized as a potential movement. This awareness influenced future policy, law, and military planning. Fear of repetition lingered within the structures of rule. Education, administration, and public life were all affected by this shift. Greater effort was made to manage difference and prevent unity. Representation was limited and controlled. The empire adapted, but it never returned to its earlier sense of ease. The legacy of 1857 also lies in its human dimension. Ordinary people had stepped into history, often without expectation or preparation. Their actions were driven by belief, anger, loyalty, and fear. These emotions gave the rebellion its force and ensured its memory would not fade. Failure did not erase meaning. In many ways, it strengthened it. The fact that such a widespread challenge could occur underlined the limits of power. Empire could punish and reorganize, but it could not erase memory or desire. As decades passed, the rebellion gained new interpretation. It was no longer only about the events themselves, but about what they represented. For dignity under pressure. For refusal to accept silence. For the moment when authority was tested and found vulnerable. The warning to empire was clear. Control without understanding carries cost. Empire absorbed the message, even as it tightened its grip. It altered how people saw power and possibility. It planted questions that would grow over time, shaping future movements and demands. When later struggles for freedom emerged, they carried different methods and visions. Yet the memory of 1857 remained in the background, a quiet influence. It reminded each generation that resistance had a history, and that sacrifice had precedent. The rebellion stands as a moment when fear and hope collided. It was shaped by confusion and courage, by division and determination. Its outcome was defeat, but its legacy was endurance. In remembering the legacy of the rebellion, it is important to move beyond simple judgment. It was neither a failure to forget nor a victory to glorify. It was a turning point, complex and human, that reshaped how rule and resistance were understood. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 did not end empire, but it changed it forever. It left behind a warning written not in law, but in memory. And from that memory, later movements drew strength, carrying forward the courage of those who had once dared to challenge power, even when the cost was immense. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was a moment when fear overcame obedience, and silence turned into action. It showed the strength of resistance and the limits of imperial power. Though defeated, the rebellion changed history forever. Thank you for listening, and for walking through this powerful chapter of the past. May remembering such moments help us understand the cost of empire and the value of freedom. Until next time, take care and stay curious.